professor of history, and I teach border history, I teach public history. Once in a while I teach Mexican American history. Because I teach Mexican American history, and because the vast majority of my students are Mexican American, one of the things that I really emphasize when I teach is that we have to look at our history as more than just a history of immigration. And it's true, the great majority of us are immigrants, children, grandchildren of immigrants. But that process of immigration is something that happens with the creation of the nation state. But if we think of ourselves as people who have been here in the Americas for thousands of years, because, you know, when they do DNA studies, the average Mexican American is 40% indigenous, some more, some less. So we have roots here. So I started to take students to Mexico, and I started to take them to Nahuatl University. And Marta Oropesa was the amazing teacher that would accompany us. And we started to learn what was part of our ancestors' lives that are still part of our lives. So language and food were the two things that students really connected to, that have stayed with us over thousands of years. So we started to go there, and then also because in my own spiritual practice as someone who connects to my indigenous roots, I've been able to study with teachers in tiny, tiny villages in el Estado de Mexico, in el Estado de Morelos, in Chihuahua. So I've been in many homes and been fed by many people. And it was in someone's home in Chihuahua where I learned how to cook nopales without water. And just the other day, because I've been looking, I had to have a name. I found it was called nopales al vapor, is what it's called. So I started to learn those things. I started to learn in Morelos about verdolagas, which grow everywhere in El Paso as, again, a weed. So I encountered them as something to eat in Morelos. So now every summer, because they grow in my next door neighbor's yard, I go into his yard and I pick his verdolagas, and I've cooked them for him and said, here's from your yard. I don't know what he thinks, but verdolagas or purslane. So one of the things that I love is to just see what's around us that we can eat. So for example, I've gone out to the desert, the Chihuahuan desert, and foraged. What is there edible? There's things like the banana yucca plant has a big fruit that if you roast it is super delicious. Or the tunas that you get out in the desert. Or I've made soup out of yucca flowers, which in Mexico are called the flores de izote. So we're surrounded by food. You know, and I think about my ancestors, because my ancestors came from the Chihuahuan desert, the Raramuri people, the Tepehuan people. So they had to forage. So I'm trying to look for what is my food. And things like the start that one over. Things like the I can't say it. Chiles, like the I can't say it. Chiltepin. Okay. So I start to look for what's my food in the desert, and one thing that is one of our foods from this desert is the chiltepin, which is a tiny, tiny little round chile. It grows wild. You can find it in people's yards. It turns into a bush. It can live for years. And chiltepin is Nahuatl for tiny chile. And it is a tiny chile. And it's super picoso. Like I can only put one in a big pot of food because it's very picoso. And I have to fight the birds for it because the birds love it. They don't taste picosones, so they just love whatever other taste it has. So I look at what is around me that I don't have to plant, that I can forage, and that's important to me too. You know, one time I went to Albertsons and I was looking for nopales. They didn't have any, and I asked the grocer, you don't have any nopales? And he just looked at me and he said, don't you have nopales in your yard? And I said, yes, I have lots of nopales in my yard. And he goes, well, just go cut one. And I thought, that's true. I go buy things that are growing in my yard just for the convenience of not cleaning them myself. Yeah. And recently, a senator from Mexico put out a YouTube video, and she talks about how the conquest happened 500 years ago, and one of the things that the Spanish brought to the Americas were pigs. And they did, because pigs provided food, but they were portable because they walked themselves, and they're not big like cows. So you could, have tons of pigs following the military. So she says in this video, so every time you eat tacos de carnitas, you're supporting the conquest. You're honoring the conquista. And I was like, oh, that's true, because I also teach in my classes about the importance of pigs and how pigs made the military conquest possible. So she's right about that. And then the next Saturday I went to Duranguito, and what did we have? Tacos de carnitas. And I had them. so it's very complex. It's very complex because it's related to spirituality, the connection among everything living, and the earth is living, and our history with food and what food has been used against us, and just the constant pressures of modern society with fast food. One of the things that I love about growing amaranto is that during the colonial period, amaranto was banned from being cultivated by indigenous people. One, because it was connected to spiritual ceremonies. And secondly, I think because amaranto is perfect nutrition. It's protein, it has minerals in it. So if you take away a food that people are dependent on and that is, perfect nutrition, it weakens them. So it weakens them spiritually then because they don't have that plant, and it weakens them physically because they don't have that nutrition. And amaranto was saved only by a few villages 100 years ago, so that now it's a big health food, amaranth. So one of the things that gives me a lot of pleasure is growing amaranto, knowing that for a long time it was not allowed to be cultivated. Mm-hmm. As a public historian, I do think about food and how it grounds people in public. So let me tell you this story. About 7 or 8 years ago, one of the indigenous elders here in El Paso, Beatriz Villegas, was invited to the History Museum to show people how to use a molcajete. And I went. So she had all the different ingredients to make a salsa. And she had a pretty big crowd, so she told people, come stand around me and I'm going to show you how to make salsa. And the thing the museum wanted was, Beatriz, teach them how to make salsa. It wasn't about the molcajete, it was just like, how do you make salsa? And I'm standing there in this crowd around her, and some women start to cry. And so she stopped and she asked, what are you feeling? And they said, we're crying because it reminds us of our abuelitas. And we haven't had that connection to our abuelitas since they passed away. And these were not young people. They were, in their 50s, 40s. And I thought, look at how this, ancient kitchen tool is bringing people back to their abuelitas' kitchens. And they were crying in a museum. So I knew then that food was super important in a museum setting. So I worked on an exhibit at La Mujer Obrera, which has a restaurant there in front, Café Mayapan. And we were looking at photos from the 1940s of Mexicanas and Mexicanos in El Paso. And I kept seeing these kitchen scenes that this photographer took in the 40s. So then my assistant then, Cynthia Renteria, and I decided we're going to replicate a kitchen scene, kind of. So it was a woman, an older woman sitting at her table. She had her cafecito. She had things like salt shakers. Behind her you could see a little shelf with a santo on it. So we got a table, we put a tablecloth on it that matched the photo. We found a santo more or less like her santo, a shelf more or less like her shelf, and we replicated the scene. And it was using things we found at the Salvation Army at Goodwill. So we first opened that exhibit, a woman walked in and looked at that and started crying. And I knew her, and I said, "Why are you crying?" And she said, "Because this is just like my abuelita's kitchen in Juarez. And I haven't seen it since I was a little girl." And it was really very simple, but the simplest of things tied to the kitchens that we remember, tied to the foods that we remember. I'm crying right now because it brings up such emotion. And as a public historian, to me the work I do goes beyond just saying, oh, in 1848 this happened, in 1912 this happened. That's not what I think is the priority, although I do use dates. Chronology is important, but what is important to me is really to help people remember their history, to help them remember what means something to them. So when I see someone crying at the sight of a kitchen setting, or see someone being very emotional watching elder use a molcajete, I know that they're remembering their history. And this is a very broad definition of history, right? But we all have a history. And to carry on those memories, and maybe they'll go tell their children or their grandchildren, "Oh, today I saw this woman with a molcajete," and then they tell the story of their mother or their abuelita. Like, that's passing on a very intimate kind of history that I think is important for us, for our spiritual health, for our emotional health, and I think it affects our physical health.